At 7:08 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalczyk hit the surf at the base of Pointe du Hoc with 100 feet of German-held limestone rising straight up in front of him, machine gun fire already tearing into the boat he'd just jumped from. 26 years old, a coal miner's son from outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, about to climb a cliff under direct fire that his own training instructors back in Scotland had privately doubted anyone could survive doing. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to watch the man beside him do something that would stick with him for the rest of his life, and he'd spend the next 60 years trying to explain it to people who hadn't been there. "You don't think about the history of it while it's happening," Kowalczyk said decades later, sitting in his own kitchen with his grandchildren half listening. "You think about the next handhold. It's only looking back that you understand what you actually lived through, and what the fellow next to you turned out to be made of." 6 German 155mm guns sat somewhere on the cliff top above him. Coastal artillery with a range of roughly 12 miles, far enough to reach both Omaha and Utah beaches from a single firing position. Each shell weighed close to 100 pounds. General Omar Bradley, commanding the entire American ground force landing that morning, had already told his own staff this was the single most dangerous mission of the whole invasion, and had approved it anyway, because 6 working guns hitting both beaches during their most vulnerable hours was a worse outcome than whatever this cliff was about to cost. Pointe du Hoc sat almost exactly between the 2 American beaches, a jutting finger of limestone giving whoever controlled it fire observation over roughly 9 miles of coastline in both directions. German engineers had built reinforced concrete casemates into the cliff top as part of Field Marshal Rommel's Atlantic Wall, and Rommel himself had inspected the position less than 2 months before the invasion, reportedly telling his staff that the first 24 hours of any landing would decide the entire war. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, Kowalczyk's commander, had spent nearly a year building the 2nd Ranger Battalion for a mission shaped roughly like this one, though nobody training under him in 1943 knew which specific cliff they'd eventually be climbing. Selection had run through a British commando depot near Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands. Forced marches, night climbs on real rock in freezing rain, live ammunition cracking close enough overhead to feel it. A man who froze on a wet cliff face during training simply wasn't there the next morning, reassigned quietly without explanation. Roughly a third of the men who started that selection washed out before ever facing a live German soldier. Kowalczyk made it through, believing there wasn't much left in the world that could genuinely rattle him. 2 other men in his same boat that morning believed similar things about themselves. Private Daniel Cole, 19, who'd lied to his own squad leader about a strained ankle 2 days before the invasion rather than risk being pulled from the mission, and Corporal Walter Sims, 22, a former merchant sailor whose cargo ship had been torpedoed in the Atlantic the year before, who'd transferred into the Rangers specifically because solid ground sounded safer than another convoy crossing. All 3 were about to learn how little that confidence actually meant once the ramps dropped. What none of them knew was that the guns they'd trained a year to destroy weren't even up there anymore. A German artillery officer, acting on his own judgment after watching the position absorb weeks of Allied bombing, had quietly withdrawn all 6 guns 3 days earlier, on June 3rd, moving them a kilometer inland and dressing painted telephone poles in their place to fool aerial reconnaissance. The deception had worked perfectly. Everything about to happen on this cliff was aimed, for the moment, at an empty position, though nobody climbing it yet had any way of knowing that. If you want to see how a Ranger Battalion took an impossible cliff under direct enemy fire, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the cliff. The trouble that morning had started before a single shot was fired. Strong currents pushed the entire assault flotilla roughly a mile east of its intended landing point, and by the time Navy crews corrected course, the force was running nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. 40 minutes in daylight instead of dawn twilight. 40 minutes for German observers who'd already spotted the boats to watch every second of the correction. Rudder said later, the delay worried him more than the cliff itself, because surprise had been the one real advantage the plan depended on, and it was gone before the ramps ever dropped. One amphibious Duku, carrying spare rocket launcher equipment, took a direct hit before it even reached the cliff. Its engine failed, the vehicle began taking water, and 3 Rangers became casualties, 1 killed, before the mission had technically started at all. Then came the moment Kowalczyk opened this story with. Ramps down, machine guns opening up from the cliff top in the same instant, as if the Germans had been waiting for exactly this and nothing before it. Rounds tore into the packed boats before men had cleared the bow. Kowalczyk, third off his own craft, watched the man directly ahead of him go down where he stood and understood, in the half-second it took to register, that this fight would open at full intensity and never ease off. Some Rangers leaped into water that looked shallow and wasn't. Weeks of naval bombardment had blasted invisible craters into the seabed close to shore, and men loaded with rifle, ammunition, and days of rations sank straight down over their heads, unable to find footing on slick gray clay. Corporal Sims went under exactly like that, the ocean finally catching up to the fear he'd carried through an entire war, saved only when another Ranger grabbed his pack straps and hauled him toward shallower ground while rounds cracked past both their heads. Others in that same water weren't so fortunate. They drowned within yards of dry land, dragged down by the gear meant to keep them fighting once they reached the top. Grappling hook rockets meant to fire ladders straight up the cliff face failed under real conditions, the way they never had in England. Seawater-soaked rope added enough dead weight that several rockets fell short into the surf. Others planted true, and German soldiers leaned over the edge and cut every rope they could reach, sending coils tumbling back down onto the men below. A handful of lines carrying small marker flares survived by pure accident, German defenders apparently mistaking them for some kind of rigged explosive and leaving those particular ropes alone. What followed for the next half hour looked less like a rehearsed operation and more like controlled desperation. Cole spent most of it on nearly 60 feet of bare rope, rifle slung across his back, passing a wounded Ranger hanging limp in his harness 2/3 of the way up, and forcing himself not to stop. Stopping meant becoming the next stationary target for a gunner, with a clean line straight down the rock. A few yards over, Kowalczyk felt his own line go slack and drop him half a foot before catching on a lower anchor, a round he'd realize only later, that had nicked but not severed the rope just above where his hands had been a moment before. This was the moment he meant, telling it decades afterward, not his own climb, but glancing sideways mid-rope and watching Cole keep moving without hesitation past a dying man, understanding, for the first time, that the kid was built out of something Kowalczyk hadn't fully appreciated in a year of training beside him. "That's the part that stayed with me," he said once, years later. "Not the fear I expected. What I didn't expect was watching 19-year-old Danny Cole keep climbing like it was nothing, like he'd done it 100 times, when I knew for a fact he hadn't. You train beside a man for a year, and you still don't know what's actually in him until the day it counts." By roughly 7:40, most surviving Rangers had made it over the cliff's edge. The part every planner in England had privately feared might prove impossible was, against nearly every reasonable expectation, done. And then, within minutes, it stopped feeling like a triumph at all. The gun emplacement stood completely empty. No barrels, no crews, just splintered painted poles, standing in casemates the Germans had abandoned days earlier, while the real guns sat inland, untouched, ready to fire on the beaches the moment American troops actually landed. A kilometer inland, in a sunken lane shielded by hedgerow, German artillery officer Lieutenant Erich Bauer had spent that same morning feeling something close to relief, that his own guns weren't sitting inside those casemates when the bombs fell. Radio traffic reaching him was fragmented and contradictory. One of his younger gunners asked twice whether they should move the guns again, given how close the fighting sounded. Bauer told him to hold position both times. The guns had survived a month by staying hidden and still, and he saw no reason that should change now, on the one morning it mattered most. Rudder faced the choice that would decide whether the last 30 minutes had meant anything at all: consolidate and report a partial failure, or split his already bloodied force further, sending small patrols into hedgerow country to hunt for guns that might have been destroyed outright, or moved miles beyond any reasonable search radius. He chose to search. Small teams fanned out toward the coastal road, men who'd just survived the worst half hour of their lives, now walking, alone or in pairs, deeper into enemy territory instead of away from it. At around 9 o'clock, a two-man patrol from Company D, First Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, pushed roughly 250 yards south of the coastal highway and found exactly what the mission had been built around locating. 5 of the 6 missing guns, camouflaged in an apple orchard, ammunition stacked beside them, oriented toward Utah Beach, 8 miles away. The 6th was never found. German voices carried across the field close enough that Lomel would remember them the rest of his life, but by whatever accident of timing, no sentry stood directly over the guns. Bauer's own patrol had swept through minutes earlier and moved on toward the coast road. Lomel carried no charges built for this, only thermite grenades meant for smaller equipment, his rifle, and by his own later estimate, perhaps 4 minutes before discovery became unacceptable. He worked the first gun while Kuhn covered the tree line, both aware a patrol rounding the wrong hedge would end everything in seconds. Thermite burned through recoil mechanisms and sights gun by gun, quiet and methodical, deep inside territory the German army still controlled. 3 guns went down to thermite before the grenades ran out. Lomel finished the last 2 by hand, smashing sights with his rifle butt. I've told that story to men who served with me for 40 years, and it still doesn't sound real, coming out of my own mouth, Kowalczyk said once. 2 men, a handful of grenades. That's what stood between those guns and 2 invasion beaches. I don't know if I'd have had the nerve to do what Lomel did that morning. I like to think I would have. I'm honestly not sure. They were perhaps 40 yards clear when Bauer's patrol doubled back roughly 6 minutes later, finding 5 ruined guns and no sign of who'd done it. Convinced for the rest of that day that an entire demolition team, not 2 exhausted sergeants, had slipped through his lines undetected. If you're still with us this far into the story, that like button really does help more people find it. Hit it now if you haven't, and let's get back to the cliff. Back at the cliff, Lieutenant James Ike Eichner spent the morning trying, with only partial success, to signal the reserve force offshore under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider that Rudder's assault had succeeded. Damaged radios meant messages went unanswered for stretches long enough that Schneider, past his deadline, made the doctrinally correct call and diverted his force toward Omaha Beach instead, leaving the men atop Pointe du Hoc to fight essentially alone, far longer than the plan had ever accounted for. Rudder set his command post in a captured bunker and organized what defense he could. The first serious German counterattack came just after 1 p.m., company strength, aimed at the eastern perimeter. Kowalczyk's machine gun crew held that line for nearly 20 minutes, burning through their own ammunition, and then belts stripped off German dead. 20 yards to his left, Cole fought with a captured rifle after his own jammed, killing 2 attackers at range he'd later described to his own children as closer than he ever wanted anyone to be. The attack broke 200 yards short of the bunker. It cost the perimeter 3 more men. A second push came at dusk against the thinner western flank. Sims fought it alongside men from companies he'd never trained with, an improvised arrangement that somehow held, aided by 5-inch naval gunfire from the USS Satterley offshore. What came after full dark was worse, a blur of short, vicious engagements, rather than one continuous battle. German patrols probing for gaps in darkness, where telling friend from enemy became its own separate danger. Around 3 a.m., a German squad worked to within 30 yards of Rudder's own bunker, before being driven off in a firefight lasting under 2 minutes. Rudder took shrapnel wounds twice that night, and refused evacuation either time. Rudder never talked about it, Kowalczyk said. Not once, not to me, not to anybody I ever heard of. 2 wounds in one night, and he just kept moving along that line like it was nothing. You don't train a man to do that. Either it's in him or it isn't. June 7th brought less concentrated assault and more attrition. Snipers in the hedgerows, mortar rounds landing without warning, the constant tension of not knowing whether the next probe was a patrol or a push the thinned perimeter couldn't survive. Cole took a graze across his forearm from a sniper round just past noon, bandaged it himself with a strip of his own undershirt, and stayed on the line. Rudder's men laid an American flag flat across open ground within the perimeter, a precaution against friendly fire mistaking their isolated position for a German one. They held through the rest of that second day, the perimeter contracting under pressure but never fully breaking. Relief finally arrived on the morning of the 8th, 2 full days after landing, when infantry and armor from the 743rd Tank Battalion linked up at last with what remained of Rudder's force. Kowalczyk said the sound of American tank engines through the hedgerows that morning was the best sound he heard in the entire war. By the time that column arrived, the Rangers had lost 135 men out of the original 225, a casualty rate above 60%, inflicted across a mission that had no reasonable business succeeding at all. The 6 guns Lommel and Kuhn destroyed never fired a single round at either beach. Whether they could have inflicted casualties approaching what German defenses managed at Omaha alone remains a question historians debate rather than settle. But the mission's planners judged the risk severe enough to send 225 men up an unclimbable cliff, and Rudder's battalion did precisely what it had been sent to do. Rudder carried his wounds home to Texas, and eventually became president of Texas A&M University. Lommel went home to New Jersey and practiced law for decades, rarely discussing publicly what he and one other man had managed with a handful of thermite grenades. Kowalczyk went back to the coal country outside Scranton and worked the same mines his father had, keeping one photograph of the cliff face framed in his front hallway for the rest of his life. Cole finished the diploma the war had interrupted, and mostly kept Normandy to himself, except at reunions decades later. Sims went back to the Merchant Marine, deciding the ocean had never actually been the dangerous part of his war. 40 years later to the day, President Ronald Reagan stood at Pointe du Hoc itself and called the men who'd climbed that cliff simply the boys of Pointe du Hoc, noting that 225 had come ashore, and after 2 days of fighting, only about 90 could still bear arms. Kowalczyk stood in that crowd with his wife, gray-haired by then, and said afterward that hearing the number spoken aloud was the first time it ever fully landed on him, all at once. Exactly what they'd lived through. We didn't think about it like that at the time, he told his grandson years later. You think about the next handhold, the next man beside you, the next 30 seconds. It's only after, looking back, that you understand what you actually survived, and what the men next to you were capable of, that none of you knew going in. The cliff and the cratered earth above it remain today largely as the Rangers left them. Bomb craters still visible, bunkers left standing rather than rebuilt, a granite monument set over the same casemates that once held nothing but painted wooden poles. It marks the place where a battalion of American soldiers scaled a cliff that shouldn't have been climbable, to destroy guns that had already been moved before they arrived, and went out anyway, found them regardless, and finished exactly what they'd come to do. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if anyone in your family served on D-Day or in Normandy, We want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure the boys of Pointe du Hoc don't disappear into silence.